Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a real deep dive into a piece of legislation that literally has the whole world talking right now. It's China's new Ethnic Unity and Progress Promotion Law. And we're going to impartially unpack the source material to figure out exactly what's going on here. Because, well, depending on who you ask, this law is either a totally necessary vehicle for economic development or a tool for cultural erasure. So let's break down both sides of this really intense debate. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the ethnic unity law itself, Mandarin and economic mobility, efforts to preserve minority cultures, Western media narratives, and finally, the big clash, modernization versus assimilation. But hey, before we hit our main topic, we need to set the stage on China's current domestic reform blitz. Our source notes a sweeping new blueprint the State Council just dropped, aimed at radically overhauling life for its 85 million disabled citizens over the next 5 years. We're talking 95% medical insurance coverage, 97% compulsory education, and 1 million new jobs created using everything from AI to barrier-free infrastructure upgrades. This gives us some super vital context for Beijing's wider, aggressive push for national modernization, which, as you'll see, sits right at the heart of the law we're looking at today. Section 1. The Ethnic Unity Law and Exploring Article 15. So the absolutely crucial point in this legislation is Article 15. You see, for decades following a 1949 model, China offered a pretty significant degree of regional linguistic autonomy to ethnic minority regions. But Article 15 totally shifts away from that. It mandates Standard Mandarin, or Putonghua, as the primary common language of instruction in schools and the official language across state organs, public institutions, you name it. And this brilliantly illustrates the timeline provided by source analyst Zun Ahmed Khan. She points out that Beijing doesn't view this law as some sudden, out-of-the-blue shift. Instead, it's the next chronological step in a decades-long effort to unify a heavily fragmented nation. I mean, think about it. Back in 1949, you had neighboring villages that literally couldn't even speak to each other. Then, through the 80s and 90s, affirmative action policies rolled out, leading to targeted poverty alleviation in 2012, and it's all driving toward Beijing's massive modernization goals for 2035. Section 2, Mandarin and Economic Mobility. Oh, and really quickly, if you're enjoying this impartial breakdown, take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe. Right, so according to the source's guest, a lack of standard Mandarin proficiency has historically trapped ethnic minorities in a really vicious cycle of poverty and what she calls ghettoization. Without fluency in the national language, young folks in minority regions face these massive systemic barriers. They're effectively blocked from competing in the Gaokao, which is the huge standardized national college entrance exam, and they really struggle to secure competitive jobs in the broader economy. Now, what's really fascinating here is how Beijing frames language standardization strictly as a pragmatic tool. To the Chinese government, this is entirely about upward economic mobility and equal opportunity. The argument basically goes, if a child in a rural, mountainous minority region doesn't speak the exact same standard language as a kid in Beijing or Shanghai, well, they're starting life at a massive, totally unfair disadvantage. Just look at the sheer scale of this for a second. 800 million. That staggering number represents the 700 million people lifted out of poverty via broader macroeconomic policies, plus another 100 million recently targeted specifically in remote and minority regions. Beijing actually uses this massive economic transformation to justify its aggressive integration policies, arguing that standardizing the language is literally the only way to ensure these final most vulnerable populations aren't left behind. Section 3. Preserving minority cultures, which naturally brings us to a huge question. Does standardizing a national language inherently mean the death of local indigenous cultures? Well, according to the source, Beijing vigorously denies that it's erasing cultures. In fact, they argue they're actively investing in preserving them. The law itself includes provisions stating that official communications have to be published side by side in both Mandarin and the local languages. On top of that, the government is handing out university grants to research ethnic histories. Minority languages are absolutely still taught as dedicated subjects in schools, and bilingual public signage is still prevalent in regions like Xinjiang and Tibet. As a really striking example of this, the source points to Yunnan province, which happens to be home to 26 distinct ethnic groups. According to the analyst, all 26 of these languages are still actively spoken, visibly written, and even financially supported by the government through initiatives like poverty alleviation conferences. They use this to push back against the whole idea that these languages are being actively wiped out. Section 4. Western media narratives. Now, we've got to pivot entirely.
we need to examine exactly how Western media and international human rights groups interpret these very same policies. Because let me tell you, their reading of this law is drastically different.
This brings us to the absolute core conflict of our explainer. If Beijing claims this is all just about lifting people out of poverty, why are Western observers, human rights organizations, and international media outlets calling this exact same law a vehicle for cultural genocide?
Western media strongly argues that replacing native tongues with standard Mandarin as the primary language of instruction isn't about mobility at all. It's a deliberate, calculated erasure of Tibetan and Uyghur identities. Critics draw some pretty chilling parallels to the colonial boarding schools used historically in North America, arguing that by forcing kids to learn primarily in a state-mandated language, the government is intentionally severing their connection to their indigenous heritage.
And the concern in the West isn't just domestic either. Critics point heavily to Article 63. This is an extraterritorial clause, meaning it states that individuals and organizations outside mainland China can actually be held legally responsible for acts that undermine ethnic unity. High-profile critics, even figures like Richard Gere in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, point to this as proof of severe government overreach. They warn this clause is going to be weaponized to silence diaspora communities, intimidate activists abroad, and crush any international dissent.
As this quote from the source discussion captures perfectly, the overarching Western narrative is that Beijing is weaponizing this law to impose a single, dominant Han identity. From this viewpoint, the law is absolutely not about equal opportunity. It's an authoritarian mandate designed to crush civil liberties, eliminate regional autonomy, and exert total control over minority populations, all under the guise of unity.
Section 5. Modernization versus assimilation. Let's directly juxtapose these two incredibly polarized viewpoints and see what the source suggests might be missing from the broader conversation.
Here, we can clearly see the dual narrative we've been unpacking all along. On the left, Beijing sees national cohesion and a shared standard language as an absolute prerequisite for development and common prosperity. But then on the right, Western critics view those exact same mechanisms as forced assimilation and a direct, blatant attack on human rights. Two completely different realities.
The source emphasizes that Western media often cherry-picks specific, punitive-sounding articles, like Articles 15 and 63, while completely ignoring the law's really extensive chapters dedicated to promoting common prosperity. These overlooked sections legally mandate funneling massive resources right into minority regions. We're talking strengthening transportation, water infrastructure, energy interconnectivity, and local public services to make sure these areas actually physically connect to the broader national economy. Looking at this breakdown, the source's guest argues there's actually a profound international double standard at play here. The analyst points out that many Western nations historically used very similar linguistic and educational integration tactics to build their own modern nation-states. Yet, she argues, when China utilizes these methods to prevent poverty and ghettoization today, they're immediately demonized under the banner of geopolitics and framed as this massive authoritarian threat. So, looking at the evidence presented in this source, where does the truth actually lie? To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. How do we, as global observers, draw the line between standardizing a developing nation to ensure economic equality and crossing over into erasing the unique, irreplaceable cultures that make a nation diverse? It's a hugely complex issue with no easy answers. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. And please, don't forget to subscribe for more structured, impartial analysis of the sources that shape our world.